September 12, 1963. 3:47 in the afternoon. 32 M48 Patton tanks rolled through the streets of Manhattan, their treads tearing up asphalt, their diesel engines drowning out the sounds of the city. Each tank weighed 50 tons, each carried a 90mm main gun. They were heading north, toward Harlem. Mayor Robert Wagner had made his decision. After 3 weeks of escalating tension, after riots that left 14 dead and hundreds injured, after property damage estimates climbed past $12 million, he was done negotiating. The National Guard deployment hadn't worked. The police barricades had failed. The political pressure from Washington was mounting, so Wagner gave the order that would define his legacy: occupy Harlem. By force, show overwhelming power, break the resistance. What the mayor didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that you don't occupy a kingdom while its king still breathes. And in Harlem, there was only one king. The call came through at 3:52 p.m., 5 minutes after the tanks crossed 96th Street. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost conversational. No anger, no threats, just 4 sentences that would stop 32 tanks in their tracks and force the most powerful city government in America to turn around. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson made one phone call and reminded everyone what real power looks like. To understand what happened that September afternoon, you need to understand what Harlem was in 1963. This wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a nation within a nation. 300,000 people packed into 2.5 square miles between 110th Street and 155th Street. It had its own economy policy, banks that moved $50,000 a day, numbers runners who employed 2,000 people, nightclubs that rivaled anything downtown. It had its own culture, the Apollo Theater, the Cotton Club legacy, jazz that came from basements and rooftops and living rooms. It had its own justice system, its own rules, its own hierarchy of power that had nothing to do with City Hall. And at the top of that hierarchy sat Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy. By September 1963, Bumpy Johnson was 56 years old. He'd survived Alcatraz. He'd outlasted Dutch Schultz. He'd negotiated with the 5 families and made them respect boundaries they didn't want to respect. He controlled the policy banks, the numbers racket, the protection networks. But more than that, and this is what people outside Harlem never understood, he was Harlem's protector. When the Italian mob tried to move in during the 40s, Bumpy pushed them back. When corrupt cops tried to shake down small businesses, Bumpy made sure they left empty-handed. When the neighborhood needed someone to stand between them and the city's violence, Bumpy stood. He didn't wear expensive suits anymore. The gray fedora was worn at the edges. His shoes were scuffed. At 56, he looked older, the lines deeper, the gray hair thinning, but his eyes were still cold calculation, still 3 moves ahead. The crisis had been building since late August. It started with a routine arrest that went wrong on 125th Street. A young man named James Powell, 15 years old, shot by an off-duty police lieutenant named Thomas Gilligan. The official story: Powell had a knife, charged the officer self-defense. The street story: Powell was unarmed, running from a fight, shot in the back. The truth probably lived somewhere between them, but truth doesn't matter when a neighborhood's been pushed too far for too long. The funeral was July 21st. By July 22nd, Harlem was burning. Protests turned into riots. Riots turned into warfare. Molotov cocktails through storefront windows. Police firing into crowds. Buildings burning on Lenox Avenue. Gunshots echoing off brownstone walls at 3 in the morning. The National Guard deployed 1,500 troops. Mayor Wagner declared a state of emergency. But the violence didn't stop. It shifted, evolved, became something more organized. Something that scared City Hall more than random rage. Because this wasn't chaos. This was controlled resistance. Strategic protests that blocked key intersections. Organized boycotts that shut down white-owned businesses. supply lines that kept the neighborhood fed while keeping outsiders out, and behind it all, coordinating without being visible, was Bumpy Johnson. Wagner's advisors told him the same thing every morning during their briefings. You've got an insurrection on your hands. You've lost control of Harlem. Either you take it back by force, or you lose the city. So on September 12th, Wagner authorized Operation Restore Order. 32 tanks, 2,000 National Guard troops, checkpoints at every major intersection. Curfew enforced at gunpoint. The plan was to roll into Harlem at 4 p.m., establish a military perimeter, and systematically restore city authority block by block. Arrest anyone who resisted. If buildings harbored resistance fighters, level them. The tanks crossed into Harlem at 3:52 p.m., 8 minutes ahead of schedule. They moved up Fifth Avenue in a column formation, turrets rotating slowly, searching for threats. Residents poured out of buildings. Some threw bottles and rocks that bounced harmlessly off armor plating. Others just stood in doorways and watched their neighborhood being invaded. The tank commanders had orders: proceed to 125th Street, establish forward command post, begin occupation zone expansion. At 3:54 p.m., the lead tank was at 115th Street. At 3:56, they passed 120th. At 3:58, they approached 125th, the heart of Harlem, the economic and cultural center, the symbolic throne. They were 2 minutes from executing the plan that would change everything. Then, at 3:59 p.m., every tank radio crackled simultaneously. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Henderson, National Guard commander on the ground. His voice was tight, confused, professional training barely holding together. The message was 7 words: all units halt, hold position, await further orders. 32 tanks stopped, engines idling, turrets still rotating, but stopped. The call that stopped them had come 60 seconds earlier. At 3:58 p.m., a phone rang in Mayor Wagner's office at City Hall. His secretary picked up. The voice on the other end asked for the mayor, direct, urgent. When she said the mayor was in a critical security briefing and couldn't be disturbed, the voice said 3 words that changed her mind. It's about Harlem. Wagner took the call. Later, he would never discuss what was said. His memoirs skip over September 12 entirely, jumping from August riots to October recovery efforts without explanation. But 3 people were in that office when he took the call: his chief of staff, his police commissioner, and his National Guard liaison. All 3 would later describe the same thing: watching Wagner's face drain of color, watching his hand tighten on the phone, watching him sit down heavily in his chair as he listened. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Wagner hung up, he didn't explain. He just looked at his National Guard liaison and said, "Pull them back, all of them, now." "Sir, we're 90 seconds from establishing the command post. The operation is..." Wagner's voice cut through like ice. "I said pull them back, turn those tanks around and get them out of Harlem. Do it now." The liaison tried again. "Mr. Mayor, with respect, if we abort now, we lose all credibility. The resistance will..." Wagner stood up. His voice didn't rise, but everyone in the room understood that this conversation was over. "You have your orders. Execute them." At 4:03 p.m., the orders went out. The 32 tanks began turning around. It took time. M48 patents don't turn on a dime, especially in narrow city streets. Tank commanders reversed, backed into intersections, rotated their massive frames. Residents of Harlem watched in confusion and then disbelief as the invasion force that had come to occupy them simply left. By 4:47 p.m., every tank had withdrawn south of 110th Street. By 5:30 p.m., they were back in their staging areas in the Bronx. By sunset, the only evidence they'd ever been in Harlem was torn-up asphalt and the stories people would tell for decades. So what happened in those 4 minutes? What did Bumpy Johnson say that could turn 32 tanks around? The answer is both simpler and more complex than you'd think. See, the thing about power that most people never understand is that real power isn't about what you can do, it's about what you can make other people believe you can do. Bumpy Johnson didn't have tanks. He didn't have the National Guard. He didn't have the city government. What he had was information, connections, and the ability to make one simple promise credible. The call went like this, according to one person who was there and spoke decades later, when all the principals were dead. "Mr. Mayor, this is Ellsworth Johnson. I'm calling about your tanks in Harlem. I want you to understand 4 things. First, if those tanks establish a command post on 125th Street by midnight tonight, there will be coordinated attacks on police stations in all 5 boroughs. Not riots, planned operations. Second, your family, your wife Barbara, your sons Robert Jr. and Duncan, they're safe. They'll stay safe. But I know where they are every hour of every day, and so do 50 other people. Third, I have documentation of certain financial arrangements you've made, campaign contributions from families you've publicly opposed, offshore accounts, real estate deals in your brother's name. Every newspaper in the city will have copies by morning if those tanks don't turn around. And fourth, and this is the important one, Mr. Mayor, I don't want to do any of this. I don't want violence. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want you to understand that you can't occupy Harlem. You never could. The only question is, how many people die before you accept that reality?" 4 points, delivered calmly. No rage, no desperation. Just a cold calculation of a man who'd been playing this game for 30 years and knew exactly which buttons to push. The brilliance wasn't the threats themselves. Any gangster could threaten violence or blackmail. The brilliance was making Wagner believe that Bumpy Johnson could deliver on every word, that the attacks were already planned, that the surveillance was already in place, that the documentation was real and ready. Whether all of it was true or half of it was bluff didn't matter. What mattered was that Wagner believed it could be true, and he couldn't take that risk. Because here's what Wagner knew that afternoon. He was already losing political support over the Harlem crisis. The civil rights movement was watching. The national press was watching. If he escalated to tanks and it still didn't work, if the violence continued, if more people died, if his family was threatened, if financial scandals emerged, his career was over. Not just his mayoralty. Everything. Bumpy gave him an out, pull back the tanks, save face by calling it de-escalation. A claim you were responding to community leaders requesting dialogue. Survive politically. Live to fight another day when the cameras aren't watching and the stakes aren't so high. Wagner took the out. Within a week, the mayor's office announced a new community relations initiative. $20 million for Harlem development, a civilian review board for police conduct, job training programs, a promise to investigate the James Powell shooting thoroughly. It was presented as Wagner's brilliant negotiation, his compassionate response to legitimate grievances. But everyone in Harlem knew the truth. They'd watched the tanks turn around. They'd seen their neighborhood defend itself, not with violence, but with the strategic deployment of one man's reputation and connections. The story spread, got embellished, got bigger. Some versions had Bumpy threatening to blow up City Hall, some had him blackmailing Wagner with photographs of affairs, some had him calling in favors from Washington. From Kennedy himself, the truth was probably simpler than the legends, but the legends mattered more, because what the legends taught was this: real power doesn't come from tanks or titles. It comes from understanding leverage, from building networks over decades, from knowing that the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun. It's information and the credibility to use it. Bumpy Johnson died 5 years later in 1968 of congestive heart failure. He was 62 years old. His funeral drew thousands of people. City officials came. The criminals came. Old ladies who ran numbers came. Shop owners came. The streets were packed with people who understood that they'd lost something irreplaceable. Not just a man, but a certain kind of protection that couldn't be replaced. Mayor Wagner served until 1965, didn't seek re-election. His political career effectively ended with his third term. History remembers him as the mayor who navigated New York through difficult racial tensions. History doesn't remember the 32 tanks that turned around or the phone call that turned them. But Harlem remembers. Old-timers still tell the story, still point out where the tanks stopped at 125th Street, still talk about the day someone with no official power, no military force, no government position made the most powerful city government in America back down with one phone call. Because that's the thing about legends. They teach lessons that outlive the men who created them. The lesson of September 12, 1963 wasn't about tanks or threats or blackmail. It was about understanding that power is a performance. The best performance wins. And nobody performed power better than Bumpy Johnson. What would you have done in Mayor Wagner's position? Would you have called the bluff? Or would you have recognized that even if it was partly bluff, the parts that weren't would destroy you? Would you have sent those tanks forward into a neighborhood where every window might hide a sniper, where every basement might store weapons, where the intelligence networks were better than anything your police had? Would you have risked your family, your career, your legacy, everything on the chance that one man was lying? Or would you have done exactly what Wagner did? Recognize that you'd been outplayed, take the exit that was offered, and live to see another day. Power isn't about who's stronger, it's about who's willing to risk more, and who can make you believe they're willing to risk it all. If this story made you rethink what power really means, hit that like button. If you know someone who needs to understand that intelligence beats force, share this video. And if you want more stories about the men who built legends out of strategic thinking and unshakable nerve, subscribe and hit the notification bell. These stories matter. These lessons echo through generations, and Harlem remembers. Drop a comment. What's the most powerful strategic move you've ever seen someone make with limited resources? Let's talk about it.